Welcome. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and I want to welcome all of you to today's national call on coronavirus, housing, and homelessness. As always, today's call has low-income renters and people with lived experience of homelessness, homeless shelter and services providers, affordable housing providers, and advocates from all around the country, as well as members of the media, staff from congressional offices and from foundations, and others. So as you probably know, negotiations over the next COVID-19 relief package seem stalled, with the president issuing over the weekend 4 executive orders and memorandums, including one that purports to help renters, but is, in the words of NLIHC President and CEO Diane Yentel, an empty shell. Congress and the White House really must take immediate action, as NLIHC and other research partners estimate that 30 to 40 million people could be at risk of eviction by the end of the year. You'll be hearing more about that during this call. It's absolutely essential that advocates keep contacting their members of Congress, particularly your Republican members, about the urgent need to pass a bill with $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, a national uniform eviction moratorium, more resources for homeless, and more support for housing providers. Prior to this call, we received many questions from participants. I think we got over nearly 40 questions prior to the call. That's great. During the call, if you'd like to ask a question, please enter it in the Q&A box. We'll use the chat for other communications, and we'll share links in there and so forth. But feel free to keep those coming. Of course, during this relatively brief call, we won't be able to answer all of those questions, and I apologize for that, but they form the basis for materials that NLIHC creates, our Q&As, our fact sheets, and so forth. So please share them with us. We are very pleased to have join us today 2 Democratic leaders. In the first, Representative Pramila Jayapal from Washington State. Representative Jayapal is serving her 2nd term in Congress, representing Washington's 7th District, which encompasses most of Seattle and its surrounding areas. She's the first South Asian American woman elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and one of only 14 naturalized citizens currently serving in Congress. As co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, she has put forward bold proposals such as the People's Housing Platform with fellow Congress members Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, and others. This broad platform includes legislation introduced by Representative Jayapal. The Housing is a Human Right Act to provide more than $300 billion over 10 years for crucial housing infrastructure and for reducing homelessness, to ensure that people directly impacted by homelessness have a voice when policy decisions are made. It is a pleasure and an honor to present Representative Jayapal. Representative Jayapal, are you there?
Hey, Paul, this is Sarah. We're working to get the Congresswoman on the line. She is, okay. She'll be on in a moment.
Okay, great. So we'll stall for just a second. If it's delayed a little bit more, we'll move on to our second speaker, or we'll get some updates from our policy VP we just heard from about some of what's going on Capitol Hill. So we'll give it just a second, see if Any word, Sarah?
Yes, they are working. Tori is working with them to help move them over. They joined us as an attendee, but not as a speaker. But she should be over shortly.
Okay.
I'm happy to give
All right.
my update if that's helpful, and then we can just stop my presentation.
That'd be great. So this is Vice President for Public Policy, Sarah Saadian from NLIC. You can talk briefly about what's going on in Capitol Hill. Sarah?
Great, thanks so much. So just to pick up on what Paul had shared earlier about the executive order that the president released, this is a real unfortunate sign that negotiations have broken down at the top level among House and Senate leadership in the White House. It's really important to know that this executive order purports to help and extend protections to renters, but it really doesn't do anything more than what the administration had already been doing, and it doesn't provide any new resources above and beyond what Congress provided in the CARES Act. So we're deeply concerned that this could lead to mislead renters into believing that they're protected when they really aren't. It merely offers false hope, and it could risk increasing confusion and chaos at a time when renters really need assurances that they won't be kicked out of their homes. And Paul had pointed to Diane's point of view in today's memo to members and partners, and so you should check it out if you have a chance to. But although the president, when signing these executive orders, said that it would help, quote, stop evictions, I mentioned before, it really does not provide any meaningful assistance to those renters who are at risk of losing their home. What's interesting here is that the president did have the authority to extend the limited federal eviction moratorium that expired on July 24th, but didn't do that in this moratorium. Instead, he just directed federal agencies to review existing authorities and resources and asked the CDC and the Department of Health and Human Services to, quote, make a determination about whether halting evictions would help prevent the spread of coronavirus. So he didn't actually go so far as to require that those agencies take action in response to that. And as I mentioned before, it doesn't provide any new resources to assist renters. Instead, it directs HUD and Treasury to essentially repackage money that has already been approved by Congress. And in many ways, this executive order is just a political game. There's no substance here. And it's unclear what happens next with negotiations now that the White House has taken this unilateral action. We have heard as of Sunday that Speaker Pelosi and Treasury Secretary Mnuchin were open to restarting negotiations, although it doesn't look as though that's happened just yet. Pelosi indicated that maybe they could consider a narrower bill, maybe one that just provides aid through the end of the year. And Mnuchin seemed open to that sort of a framework, which would be much smaller in scope. It's interesting to note that if we were to see assistance provided to the end of the year, that means that it really wouldn't change the status quo until after the election, and possibly a new president or a new Congress would come in and have to deal with this. So we'll see what that means for negotiations long term. But still, despite that, Republicans and Democrats are very far apart on where they are. Democrats have offered a $3.4 trillion bill. Many Republicans say that they won't spend anything more than $1 trillion on pandemic relief, and some don't even think we should do anything at all. Over the weekend, Democrats again offered to decrease their ask to $2 trillion if Republicans would go up to $2 trillion, but we haven't seen that both sides were willing to accept that deal. I will say there is going to be increased pressure to get back to the negotiating table over the coming weeks. That's because we all know that the eviction moratorium from the CARES Act expired on July 24th, and UI benefits ran out at the end of the month last month. But most recently, over this weekend, the Paycheck Protection Program, which provides loans to help keep small businesses open, that also stopped taking applications. And so there's going to be more and more pressure, especially from small businesses that are demanding to see Congress take action. I will say that, it's hard to know what the timing is or what the scope of this next package is, but if there is a deal, it's clear that housing and homelessness is at the top of the priority list for Democrats, which is great, and that Republicans are anticipating that they'll have to negotiate over those resources. And so while it seems like there's chaos, and there is chaos at the very highest levels, we are all in a very good position to make sure that the resources that we're fighting for are included in the next bill. And so it's important that we not wait while Congress is stalling these negotiations. We should continue to weigh in with senators and representatives and push for the resources that we need. This is underscored by new research that LHC and other groups have put out, other researchers put out, that estimate that 30 to 40 million renters are at risk of eviction by the end of the year. And so our work is so important. So please help us keep up the pressure. If you, I see that the Congresswoman has joined on, and so I will stop there and turn it back to Paul.
Thank you, Sarah. And there were a number of questions in the Q&A that we'll come back to you on if you want to take a look at those. Representative Jayapal, I know that your time is very limited. I already did an introduction, so I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us. So I can see her there. Maybe you're on mute. Bottom left-hand corner of your screen, or *6 to unmute. Representative Jayapal, we have you.
Oh.
Hello. I heard something. Sarah, maybe you could reach out and it said you stopped my video.
I see that Tori is going back and forth with her office trying to work something out. But I'm happy to see if maybe Congresswoman Waters is on the line. Oh, I see that Congresswoman Jayapal is on the line now, but her line looks to be unmuted. Maybe it's muted on her personal side. Can you give that a try?
Representative Jayapal, can you test it here?
Can you hear me even if you can't see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
we absolutely
great.
Can.
So
we use this as a call, so we actually don't have video attached to this. So
oh, got it. Okay, great. Well, here I am. Thank you so much, Paul. Sorry for the technical problems, but it's a pleasure to join the National Low Income Housing Coalition. You have had such a powerful voice during this pandemic, pushing to make sure that tenants and lower income people and folks experiencing homelessness are front and center in Congress. And it's also fantastic to be with our awesome Chairwoman Waters, who has been such an incredible leader in ensuring that the House pass legislation to ensure affordable, safe, and discrimination-free housing for all. So I wanted to just start with this shared understanding that housing is a human right. It's not a commodity, it's not a luxury, it's not a reward. It is something that every single person needs and must have. And we know that housing instability tracks systemic inequality. Communities of color, LGBT people, people with disabilities, seniors, veterans, foster and former foster youth and justice system involved people disproportionately face homelessness and housing instability. An estimated 19 million children more than 1 in 4 are currently in a household that is behind on rent or mortgage payments, is not getting enough to eat, or both. And a disproportionate number of those children are Black and or Latinx. This is absolutely unacceptable. Now, to address those urgent short-term needs, Congress must pass another relief package immediately, and that package has to include an extension and an expansion of the nationwide moratorium on evictions and foreclosures, as well as $100 billion in rental assistance to keep people in their homes. The House already passed this relief package as part of the HEROES Act, and it's unconscionable for us to leave our neighbors teetering towards homelessness, and leaving our neighbors behind will irreparably scar our communities and deepen racial inequality. So as the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, one of the largest caucuses in Congress, we have made it clear that protecting tenants is a key priority for us, and we have been continuing to push Republicans to do exactly that. The most crucial thing that we can do is to keep our communities housed. But I do want to recognize that even before this pandemic hit, many of our neighbors were already experiencing homelessness. And that's why relief also has to include additional funds to support safe housing and services for people experiencing homelessness. And we also need long-term relief, and that is why you mentioned my Housing as a Human Rights Act. It provides 10 years of dedicated funding to communities experiencing homelessness, and it also makes some very strategic interventions. First of all, it recognizes that homelessness tracks systematic inequality, and it requires targeted investments in communities that are experiencing disproportionate homelessness, because my belief is that we have to recognize inequality to address it properly. Second, the Act invests $100 million a year in community-driven alternatives to criminalization of people who are experiencing homelessness. And in addition, where recipients of emergency solutions grants or continuum of care grants can show that they're investing in alternatives to criminalization, the bill waives grant matching requirements. Third, the Act takes direction and leadership from people who have experienced homelessness, recognizing that people who are directly affected are the ones to whom service systems must be accountable. Fourth, the Act creates a program modeled off community development block grants programs, but requires those funds to be used exclusively to create or maintain affordable housing and other forms of infrastructure and services to support people experiencing homelessness or housing instability. I like to say that I'm the hope dispenser, and so I also want to share some hope with you. This crisis is human created, and it has been caused by laws and practices that privilege the monetary value of land and property. That also means that it's fixable if we work together towards the world we'd like to share. Everybody has power with their voices and with their stories. And so to all of you dedicated advocates on this call, please do not stop demanding immediate relief for tenants and people who are homeless or housing unstable, even as we push for security and equality for every neighbor in our community. Thank you so much for having me with you, and sorry for all the technical problems that we had here.
No, our apologies to Representative Jayapal. Thank you so much for your leadership on Housing is Human Right Act, for your working tirelessly to try to get the provisions necessary to respond to the COVID-19 situation in housing and homelessness. I know you were on a very tight time frame and had a hard stop that I think we've already passed. So I just want to say thank you so much for your leadership, and we will not stop our fight to get these things passed. Thank you so much.
Paul. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, advocates, for all the work you're doing.
Thank you again. Okay, provided that we don't have technical difficulties, our next speaker is Representative Maxine Waters, who you all know is a formidable presence in Congress. She serves as the chair of the House Financial Services Committee. She's the first woman and the first Black member of Congress to hold this position. As one of the most powerful women in American politics, Chair Waters has used her platform to amplify a key issue facing low-income people, the lack of affordable and accessible homes. He's one of the strongest champions on issues of housing and homelessness in Congress today. And while it would take this entire call to go through all of the housing bills she's introduced, I just want to highlight her outstanding work drafting the essential housing and homelessness resources and protections in the HEROES Act, including NLIC's top priorities. We'll continue to work closely with her and her staff to ensure that these protections and provisions are included in any final COVID-19 relief packages that Congress enacts. Representative Maxine Waters, are you with us? Hope against hope, I guess. Sarah, do we have any word from Representative Waters?
Yes, they too are also having trouble logging on. And
okay.
We're working to get on. I'm sorry, Paul.
That's okay. Sarah, we had some questions. Could respond to a couple of them. One of them was, how do you go back to the table with someone who's left, I'm assuming Capitol Hill, and gone back home for recess?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because even though senators and representatives are back home right now, there's still a lot of work being done by their staff and by the very highest congressional leaders. So we know that Schumer and Pelosi's staff are working hard. Senator Brown, Maxine Waters' staff are still doing a lot of work, even though the Congress people are back in their districts. What we've heard is that, this is a very valuable time for them to be gearing up for the elections coming up this fall. And so they really want to be home so that they can be meeting with voters and doing town hall events and those sorts of things. And what we've heard is that congressional leaders are allowing them to do that with the promise that they will call them back for a vote once a deal has been struck. Typically it takes a little bit of time for once a deal is made to turn that deal into legislative text. Sometimes it can take a week, sometimes it can take a little bit more or less, and that would give members of Congress enough time to fly back to DC to take a vote on the bill. So even though they have left town, there still is a deal to be made.
Great. There's another question here. If emergency rental funds are provided through the end of the year only, do we have an estimate of how much would be needed to avert mass evictions? How do you respond to that?
I don't know off the top of my head. I know that when NLIC and others have put together their estimates, they frequently look at what would be the monthly cost to provide that assistance. And so you could conceivably think of a bill that only provides you with the last several months worth of rental assistance. I think the bigger issue is that having a bill that's short like that doesn't provide landlords and tenants with enough sense of security, a sense of certainty about what will happen. It certainly would help avoid evictions and push that off. But we really need long-term solutions, not just for this immediate pandemic, but looking into the future to make sure we're not in a position like this going forward.
Okay. Just checking in with the rest of the NLIC team. Do we have any word about Chairwoman Waters being able to join the call?
It looks like Tori has identified Congresswoman Waters and is moving her over as a presenter.
So someone asked a question about somebody saying, can I access a recording of this webinar? Yes, we'll be sending that out to you all after the call with a link to how to access the call after the webinar. Another question here is, if Trump asked for FEMA emergency funding as a short-term solution, That's a very good question, and it's one that we have raised. It's like one of the solutions is moving FEMA resources to provide, unemployment assistance. And, this really terrible idea when we're getting ready for what most forecasters are expecting to be a very, very severe hurricane season. We need those resources. So that's a good question.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to that, Paul, that really points to the recklessness of the executive orders and how little it actually achieves for struggling families. So on the one hand, it purports to provide emergency unemployment insurance benefits to households, but if it's doing that by taking away from emergency funds that are used to protect against hurricanes and earthquakes, and if it does that by just shifting funds around from one pot to another, but without increasing the resources, it's really just a smokescreen for bad politicking. It's about gamesmanship more than it really is about helping households.
Very good. There's another question here. What bill would waive matching funds requirements for COCs demonstrating effort to decriminalize homelessness? That's something that you would be able to respond to, Sarah? Or we?
Yeah, I think that's the bill that Representative Jayapal was talking about for Housing as a Human Right Act. Her bill is a very forward-looking bill that looks at how can we reform our not our criminal justice system, how do we reform our homelessness response system to make sure that we're encouraging state and local governments to take the right actions. And so one key piece of our bill is incentivizing localities to stop criminalizing homelessness and to see housing as a solution to homelessness rather than handcuffs.
So another question is here, does anyone understand what the eviction protections and foreclosure help in Trump's executive orders might actually do, or the gaps? And I think, Sarah addressed that frankly, there's very little there that it actually stipulates and requires for as truly eviction protections and foreclosure help. It's asking agencies to explore what options there are. It really does not does not extend the eviction moratorium or the foreclosure moratoriums that were even the relatively limited ones that were in the CARES Act. So the gaps are huge, basically because very little.
I'm going to interrupt you there because I believe the chairwoman should be able to speak on the line. It says that her line is unmuted. So,
Chairwoman Waters, are you there? Chairwoman Waters, are you able to speak to us? That doesn't seem to be the case there, Sarah.
No, maybe we should move to our next speaker and then we'll just pause our agenda if she's able to join back on the line.
Just what I was going to say. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have our next speaker is Siobhan Kealey, Office of Multifamily Analytics and Policy at the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And so, Siobhan, are you there?
I am here. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Sounds so good, too.
All right, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the National Low Income Housing Coalition for inviting me to speak today and for all of the great work that you do. Thank you also to Representative Jayapal. It's always great hearing from you and, honored to be presenting alongside both you and Representative Waters. So tough acts to follow. I'll try to do my best. Again, I appreciate the invitation to be able to discuss some of the recent announcements that the Federal Housing Finance Agency has made on the multifamily side, which we are really excited about. As others just spoke to, the coronavirus pandemic has created challenges across the United States on a scale that many of us never thought would be possible. And among those that have been hardest hit by the pandemic are the low and moderate income families, many of who are renters living in multifamily properties. No one should have to worry about being put out of their home during this national health emergency, which is why FHFA has taken action to support multifamily borrowers and renters during this unprecedented crisis. So today, I plan to share with you some of the recent actions FHFA has done to help tenants that have been impacted by COVID-19, which I know is a topic of interest to many of you here on this call. So when the COVID-19 outbreak first began, FHFA anticipated that many Americans would not be able to keep up with their monthly rental payments. On March 23rd, to keep renters in multifamily properties in their home and to support multifamily property owners, FHFA instructed the enterprises, and again, this was pre-CARES Act, to provide forbearance to multifamily property owners on the condition that they suspend eviction of tenants struggling to pay rent due to the pandemic. On May 4th, at FHFA's direction, the enterprises published online multifamily property lookup tools so that tenants may determine if the multifamily property in which they reside has an enterprise-backed mortgage. This was the first time any such tool had been created by the enterprises on the multifamily side. On June 29th, FHFA announced that forbearance for multifamily properties may extend up to 6 months, which was twice as long as the period required by the CARES Act. The eviction protections for tenants in multifamily properties include any extended forbearance, meaning that while the property is in forbearance, the landlord must suspend evictions for renters for non-payment of rent. Additionally, if forbearance is extended, the repayment schedule is modified, or a new forbearance agreement is executed, the borrower is required to provide tenant protections during the borrower's repayment period. These protections include giving the tenant at least 30-day notice to vacate, not charging the tenant late fees or penalties for non-payment of rent, and allowing the tenant flexibility to repay back rent over time and not in a lump sum. So today, I'm excited to announce that for the first time, FHFA will be requiring the enterprises to increase awareness of available tenant protections by requiring multifamily property owners with a new or modified forbearance agreement to inform tenants about tenant protections during the property owner's forbearance and repayment periods. So what does that mean? Essentially, property owners will now be required to provide tenants written notice about the protections within 14 days of the start of the forbearance period. The notice must include a disclosure of the property's forbearance status and the dates of forbearance, information about residential tenant protections, including suspension of evictions, the specific dates of the tenant protections, and direct contact information for the property manager. FHFA is also requiring borrowers to certify to their servicers once the notification is complete. This will help servicers ensure that borrowers are compliant with the loan agreement. We believe that increasing the awareness of tenant protections will provide tenants greater clarity and reduce the possibility of unlawful evictions. We also believe that requiring borrowers to certify that they have notified tenants will help servicers monitor their borrowers' compliance with the loan agreement. The final update I can share with you today are improvements that we are making on the enterprise's individual online multifamily property lookup tools. As a reminder, back on May 4th at FHFA's direction, the enterprises launched separate online lookup tools available to the public, allowing tenants to provide a property address to determine whether a multifamily property has a loan that is owned or securitized by one of the enterprises. Since then,
Hey,
FHFA
Siobhan?
and the enterprise, yep.
I'm very sorry. This is so important, but
We got, no.
do you
we've
mind
got-
pausing just a second because we have Chairwoman Waters ready to go?
Absolutely. Yep.
I will
Nope,
come
go
back
ahead.
to you, I promise. Okay.
No worries.
Chairwoman Waters, are you with us?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Gee, I'm so sorry. We seem to have a little difficulty, and we didn't get in at the time that perhaps, coordinated with the way that you had laid out the program. But I thank you for inviting me to join on the call. And let me give thanks to Don Yento, the president and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Chief Operating Officer Paul Kealey, and all of the staff and members of the coalition for all of the work that you do. I'm deeply appreciative for your longstanding work, of course, advocating for affordable housing for the nation's lowest income families. The work that the coalition is especially critical for is what you're doing now on the precipice of an eviction crisis. Now, according to the apartment list, 34% of our renters were unable to pay their rent in full in the first week of August, including about 11% who also had not paid the July rent either. For months, I've been fighting for an extension of the recently lapsed federal eviction moratorium, the creation of a $100 billion emergency rental assistance fund, and other key housing relief measures during this pandemic crisis. So in March, I fought to get emergency rental assistance and protections included in the CARES Act. In May, I convened a roundtable on the impacts of COVID-19 and the impacts that it is having on renters and families. So in June, I held a Financial Services Committee hearing on the issue. Now, in the HEROES Act, I successfully fought for emergency rental assistance and the extension of the eviction moratorium to be included. I also introduced the Emergency Housing Protections and Relief Act, which passed the House at the end of June to provide $100 billion to emergency rental assistance program, $75 billion for homeowners, and extend the eviction and foreclosure moratorium put in place by the CARES Act through March 2021. Then on July 23rd, I held a full committee hearing all over again to highlight the urgency need to pass the HEROES Act. It has been 87 days since the House passed the HEROES Act and 41 days since the House passed that additional legislation to extend the moratorium and create a $100 billion rental assistance fund and a $75 billion homeowners assistance fund. The Republican-controlled Senate has completely failed to act to avert this impending housing crisis. The so-called relief bill that the Senate Republicans have put forth amounts to a slap in the face to families across the country. It does absolutely nothing to avert the impending eviction crisis, prevent homelessness, or provide urgent immediate relief to renters who are struggling to make rental payments. Likewise, the president's recent executive order on evictions is nothing more than a smoke and mirrors. The executive order provides no new funding to assist renters and does not extend the eviction moratorium. It's a shameless attempt to deceive people and to paper over Republicans' complete failure to act on legislation to prevent evictions. We urgently need the passage of a statutory extension of the eviction moratorium and the creation of the Emergency Rental Assistance Fund to help struggling renters pay accumulated now back rent. So, as chairwoman of the House Committee on Financial Services Committee, I'm doing everything I can to make sure that these protections and relief are passed into law. And so I want to thank you guys for working with us and for your outstanding advocacy for America's lowest income families. We need to hear from people on the ground across the country what you're experiencing. Please reach out to Esther and Charlotte on my staff and share what is going on in your community. I know that you have talked about what this president has done with his so-called executive order. That's nothing but a political ploy. They walked away from the negotiations so that the president could step in and send this message out politically that he is saving the people from the failed negotiations. And when you take a look at what he did for rental assistance, as you have already explained, this so-called extension or expansion was smokescreens. It was nothing. And, of course, there was no money. And, of course, he left it up to all the agencies to review, to analyze. I don't know what that's all about, to come up with what their thoughts are about it. I don't know what that means. It means nothing. We've got to advocate for getting them back to negotiate. Nancy went in to negotiate. She put $1 trillion on the table from the $3 trillion bill They want just $1 trillion overall for the entire HEROES bill. That's not going to work. The cities and the states are in desperate need of money. And so they need to get back to negotiate. They need to get back to, continue to talk about what a desperate situation this country is in. Thank you for your work. Keep putting the pressure on. Everybody's got to do that so that we can get something done for the people who need it so desperately. And thank you very much for having me.
Chairwoman Waters, thank you so much. There is no stronger champion on all of this than you, and we so appreciate your leadership. I assume we're way over the time. I won't ask you to stay for questions. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but I thank you so much for joining this call and for all you're doing on Capitol Hill, and we will do our part. We'll continue to fight for these provisions that are so absolutely necessary. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, everybody. Keep fighting. Okay.
All right, we will. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go back to Siobhan. Sorry for interrupting you there, Siobhan. Can you pick up where you left off?
Sure, absolutely, no problem at all. I was as a quick refresher, giving an update on the Enterprise's individual online multifamily lookup tools. So again, as a reminder, back on May 4th, at FHFA's direction, the Enterprises launched separate online lookup tools that are available to the public, allowing tenants to provide a property address to determine whether a multifamily property has a loan that is owned or securitized by one of the enterprises. Since then, FHFA and the enterprises have been working to improve the lookup tool's accuracy and make it easier for tenants to find out if they live in an enterprise-backed property. We're hoping to soon include some form of a zip code search functionality in the lookup tools. And then the lookup tools landing pages will also be updated to include a list of the tenant protections that I had mentioned earlier. That includes the 30-day notice to vacate, not charging the tenant late fees, and allowing the tenant some flexibility in the repayment. That will go ahead and also be on the landing page. Again, just letting a tenant know that they may qualify if the property that they reside in is in forbearance. I think our hope is that by providing a list of tenant protections that are tied to forbearance, this will really encourage a dialogue between tenants and their individual landlords about the forbearance status of a property. FHFA will continue to monitor the coronavirus's impact on tenants, borrowers, and the mortgage market, and we are committed to updating policies as needed. For more information about a lot of the stuff that I talked about today, please visit our webpage at fhfa.gov or CFPB's website at cfpb.gov/housing. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. And I will just point out that Diane and Sarah had a conversation with FHFA Director Mark Calabria last week about these changes, and he verified that really it was one of these calls where FHFA Director Calabria spoke, and Diane asked him about, how will renters know that the forbearance protections are happening? They won't necessarily otherwise know that a property they're living in has gotten a mortgage forbearance, and that it was that question and us inquiring about that, Diane inquiring about that led him to say, we really do need to require that there are renter protections for any property owner that's getting a mortgage forbearance, and that it was a result of this call that got him to move that forward. So we're so grateful for having you on this call and for clarifying that. The other thing that came up during that conversation that we had when Director Calabria joined us on the call was currently small rental properties, 1 to 4 units, are not included in the database, and Diane inquired if there would be a way to list those units. We understand that there are restrictions, privacy kinds of considerations for mom and pop owners, but that would there be a way to list those properties that are owned by institutional investors like Blackstone and indeed, Director Calabria followed up on that as well, and that is now included. And we just thank you so much for you and Director Calabria and everybody at FHFA for following up on those concerns or questions that we had from our previous call.
No, absolutely. And thank you again. We really appreciate it. Said all the feedback that you guys provide, and it's something that we take to heart, and we're trying to make a lot of the policy decisions based on feedback that we're hearing from others. So thank you again.
Okay, fantastic. There are a couple of other questions that have come in. If you have a few more minutes, there's one, for example, about FHFA, how it'll oversee enforcement of the new actions and so forth. If you have a chance, we won't have time to do that live, unfortunately, right now. But if you have a chance to answer some of those questions online while you're still with us, that would be great. If not, we can follow up with you.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I appreciate your patience. Okay, we're going to move on to our next presenter. And we have with us Zach Neumann, the founder of the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project, researcher at the Aspen Institute. And he's going to talk a little bit about the estimates of the threat of evictions and the cost of inaction. So Zach, are you with us?
I am here. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for having us back on. I think when we spoke with everyone last, we shared an update that we had developed at the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project, estimating that 19 to 23 million Americans may be at risk of eviction due to the COVID-19 crisis. We have subsequently updated that estimate, working with the Aspen Institute and, of course, with the research team at NLIHC. And that number now has pushed up to almost 30 million people on the low end and potentially 40 million on the high end. These estimates were largely developed by my colleague and our data team lead, Sam Gilman, who's been working very hard on this information. And basically the departure and the reason the number has gone up from that 19 to 23 million to somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 million is a change in the data we have available. And so I'm sure many of the folks on this call are used to seeing the census pulse survey data that's provided every week by the US Census Bureau. And basically that survey asked two questions. The first is, were you able to pay your rent fully and on time last month? And then secondarily, how confident do you feel about being able to do so next month? Obviously, since the start of the crisis, those numbers have gone up, but Sam Gilman's work basically has tried to take that data, build it into our pre-existing economic model to give a little bit more of an accurate picture of what's going on in communities around the country. And so based on people's own perceptions of their well-being, that number has gone up. And so we find this very concerning. I'm sure everyone on the line finds it very concerning. And we're actually starting to see this play out in our client work in Colorado. So one of the things that we've noted over the weekend and last week is that the number of intakes that we're getting for our legal practice seem to be going up virtually every day. So more and more intake forms being filled out, more requests for our housing fund. And so that has been concerning. And I think in that same context, one of the things that we've been trying to communicate to policymakers is that as these numbers go up, that 30 to 40 million people who are at risk won't completely manifest themselves in eviction filings, in eviction judgments, because to us, those are a trailing indicator of the housing crisis. As everyone on the line knows, many of the individuals impacted by this crisis will simply move out when they get a demand on their door. They'll move out when that first notice comes, or maybe when they're filed against, they'll decide to move out either into a homeless shelter or with family or to a hotel when that notice comes. And so one of the messages that we've been trying to communicate to policymakers is that don't just look to eviction filings to track this number, also look to broader community displacement, because that number really makes a difference. So I'll leave it at that. I think we're going to continue to update this number as the crisis unfolds, and fairly soon we're going to be charting it against actual filings in different states. So we may be back on in the future to provide an update, but happy to take questions if there are any, and just appreciate the chance to briefly update on that research and the numbers we're seeing out in the world.
Thank you so much, Zach. There was a request to provide access to your most recent analysis, and we'll provide that. There was a question, is there a way to contextualize to smaller localities such as cities and counties?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now, we have this data available only at the state level. We may be able to provide guidance on that. So if there are questions, feel free to reach out. You can reach me at Zach, Z-A-C-H, at cedproject.org, or Sam, again, who is the leader on this research and our data and analytics guru, Sam at cedproject.org, and we might be able to provide some guidance on how you may do this in your community.
Okay, fantastic. Zach, there are a few more questions. If you have time,
Sure, no, absolutely.
to stay with us and take a look at those, that would be great. If not, again, we can follow up with you directly. Really appreciate you sharing this new information with us, for working with the NLIC research team on that report, and really for all you're doing throughout this crisis. So thank you so much.
No, happy to do it.
Okay, we're going to move back. The congressional action that we all need to be involved in, just to ask our VP for Public Policy, Sarah Saadian, if there's anything else she wants to add from her comments earlier. Sarah, are you still there?
I am, but I think I'm all set. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sarah. All right, a little bit about needed advocacy from all of you around the country. We have a Director of Field Organizing, Joey Lindstrom from NLIC. Joey, are you with us?
Hey, I'm here, Paul. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Great. So thanks everybody for joining the call today. This is definitely an important moment for advocacy. If you've been joining these calls each week, you've heard me say that now several times. But this is a real moment of fever pitch and urgency because Congress is now really at the point where they're starting to trade things with one another in these negotiations. We exist in a moment of great cooperation in the movement for social justice, where education advocates and healthcare advocates and housing advocates are all working together well and coordinating. But please know that as housing advocates, we need to make sure we're in touch with members of Congress and their staff to say that housing programs cannot be left behind in negotiations. And we need to take a stand on rental assistance and the need for a nationwide comprehensive eviction moratorium. We really need to make sure those priorities are clear. If you've been in touch with the housing staff person for your members of Congress and you feel like they've heard from you so many times that they're getting bored with the message that you're repeating, I encourage you then to send another email, make another phone call, or recruit allies in your community or other people who you think might not have yet raised their voice to do so as well. This is a moment where staffers in particular are really overwhelmed with a lot of the proposals that are being shared back and forth, or they might be in a position where they don't want to share any gossip because things are somewhat tense or moving in a precarious manner on Capitol Hill. Please remember, if you're not hearing back from a particular staff person, that doesn't mean they're not reading your emails. That doesn't mean they're not seeing it. We know because we work with them and we hear from them that they are valuing a great deal what they are hearing from constituents. Indeed, Representatives Jayapal and Waters shared with us earlier that it's the advocacy from all of the people on this call that has moved housing to such a great position of priority in these negotiations. Please keep that up. Please encourage your networks and your communities to keep it up. I do want to share, I got a great update from Brooke on the field team earlier today that we are now over 1,000 organizations on our rental assistance organizational sign-on letter. And we are at 801 organizations that are on the broader sign-on letter about the full housing asks in the HEROES Act. If you are not yet signed on to those letters, please do so, and please blast them in your networks. Finally, I want to say, and Lisa Marlow, who is coming after me, will largely bring this up as well. But this is a moment where we need to communicate with our legislators in a way that is public, letting them know that we're expecting leadership from them, and we're expecting them to stand strong on housing asks. Making sure that you're doing this through social media can be really powerful, but we're also eagerly recruiting anyone who can do some work to put op-ed pieces in local newspapers or on blogs or on your own blogs and share about that in social media, because we want to make sure that the $100 billion of rental assistance we're pushing for, the comprehensive eviction moratorium, and the $11.5 billion in emergency solutions grant funding are all priorities as these negotiations move forward. So please add your organizations to the sign-on letter, reach out to staff people for members of Congress in the coming days. This is an extremely important moment, and we hope that you'll all maintain intensity in your advocacy and your outreach efforts. Please be in touch with myself or anyone else from NLIHC's field team if you need any of the resources and tools that we've made available, such as the template email or contact information for particular staffers, and we'll get that to you right away. That's all I have, Paul, unless anybody has questions.
Great, Joey. Thank you so much. All fantastic suggestions. I just want to respond to a comment by Melody, who said, what about GOP staffers? The Dems support our efforts already. I think that's a very good point, and it is one that we strongly urge. Basically, right now, we need the GOP members of Congress to be hearing two things, I think, housing, rental assistance, stopping evictions, but also, the president's actions are not enough. We need real action. That is not going to cut it. We need you guys to get back to the negotiating table. And they just have to hear that so much so that, we're not in the stalemate that we're in right now, which is, sort of on stall. They just need to hear, especially GOP, members of Congress and their staffers, this is not going to work. We need them to get back to the negotiating table, and we need rental assistance and rent relief now. So please, that's a very good question, very good point. Anybody in congressional districts or in states that are led by congressional senators, represented by congressional GOP senators, please often, and they need to hear it loudly. So thank you. And thanks, Joey. Okay, so for some guidance on what we can do in the communications front, we have Manager of Media Relations and Communications at NLIC, Lisa Marlow. Lisa, you there?
I'm here, Paul. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go right ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. So I wanted to share a couple of facts with everyone. A pediatrician in Boston recently shared with me this morning that she had 5 families come into their hospital over the weekend because they had no other place to go. Diane Yantel was on MSNBC with Lindsay Reiser this weekend, where she shared an interview with a renter by the name of Sami, who talked about the nightmare he's experiencing trying to stay stably housed with 2 children, no job through no fault of his own, and no real assistance from the federal government. Zach just talked about the new research showing how 30 to 40 million people are at risk of being evicted by the ending of this year if no real changes are made. So I'm sharing those examples to emphasize how harmful and reckless the executive orders are that the president signed this weekend. As Sarah mentioned, these orders did nothing to stop evictions and homelessness during this time and act only to mislead renters into believing they are protected when they are not. So NLIC partners and advocates on this call must use the resources, tools, and really have the responsibility to share accurate information within your network, with members of Congress, and with the media on the impact of this wave of evictions and increase in homelessness will have not only on renters like Sammy, but on your community, healthcare systems, the economy, and everyone's overall well-being. So some tools that you can use are NLIC's advocacy toolkit that contains tips on how to schedule a meeting with members of Congress and what to say during that meeting to convey the importance of rental assistance and a uniform national eviction moratorium. While meeting with members of Congress, don't hesitate to share recent news stories on evictions, op-eds on the need for rental assistance, or research such as the joint report on the estimated number of people who are at risk for eviction. You can also share NLIC's Out of Reach report or information to show connections between the links between housing and healthcare. NLIC and the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign have been working closely with partners like Boston Medical Center and Children's Health Watch to highlight these connections. Pediatricians Catherine Coughlin, Megan Sandel, and Amanda Stewart just recently authored a blog on how the looming rise in family homelessness will harm child health. I would encourage everyone to check this blog out and share. I'll share a link to it in the chat later. Even if you haven't been successful with scheduling a meeting with your member of Congress, publicly acknowledge that members' activities around their support or non-support for housing provisions and resources in the next relief package. NLIC has been keeping a running list of supporters of the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act on our website. Take some time to thank those supporters publicly on social media and in op-eds or letters to the editors. But also thank those members not listed or who have not publicly supported housing resources in the next relief package, and ask them what their plan is to keep the 30 to 40 million people housed through this year and beyond. Use resources in NLIC's social media toolkit that contains sample social media images, posts, and language you can use as a foundation for a local op-ed. Sign up for NLIC's email alerts so that you can receive information on calls to action in real time and updates on what's happening in Congress. Track and share NLIC in the news stories that's located in NLIC's memo to members and partners. This is a really good snapshot of news stories currently in the news that support the need for housing provisions and resources in the next spending bill. Retweet, repost news stories, research on social media that illustrate the urgency around federal action. Follow NLIC on Twitter and Facebook, and engage on posts by reposting or commenting with new information or local updates. Tag members of Congress, reporters, and others in your social media network who may be interested in seeing real-life impacts, hearing about new research and data. And don't forget to include the hashtag #RentReliefNow so that we can all track and be a part of the conversation. We're already seeing the wave of evictions happening, and it's only going to get worse without any federal action. America just cannot wait. We must continue to communicate this throughout our network, and especially to Senate Republicans. They must continue to hear that immediate action is needed and that they must pass those essential housing provisions and protections that passed the House over 2.5 months ago. Every day of inaction puts more seniors, people with disabilities, families, and other individuals at imminent risk of losing their homes in the middle of a pandemic. Representative Jayapal said it best today when she said that everyone has power with their voices and stories. So we hope that you can use these tools to share your voices and stories to demand comprehensive solutions now. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Paul. Paul?
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Anyway, I just want to say thank you to Lisa for that fantastic overview, and to mention that we had Senator Schumer and House Leader Pelosi on recent calls and asked them what's the most important thing to do. They both said stories in local media really get through, particularly in Republican areas. You know, get as much communications out there as you can, get as many stories as possible, get reporters to realize what's going on and what needs to be done. And then, of course, all of the other things that Lisa talked about, the social media and so forth. Really, now is the time to ramp it up as much as we possibly can. So thank you to Lisa. Okay, so we're going to move on now to our field updates. And I believe our first update is, yes, by Pam Atwood, Director of Housing Policy at the North Carolina Housing Coalition. Pam, are you there?
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to join this week's call. First, I want to say thank you to the National Low Income Housing Coalition for their leadership and all of the great work that they do with Congress and at the federal level. The COVID-19 resources that NLIHC has been providing have been a big help to us in North Carolina with our advocacy work. So I'm with the North Carolina Housing Coalition. We are a statewide membership and advocacy organization. We work to ensure that all North Carolinians have a home in which to live with dignity and opportunity. So I'm here today to give a quick update on what the situation has been here in North Carolina and what we're seeing with regards to housing and COVID-19. I think like many folks across the country, our main concerns have been around staving off evictions and maintaining housing stability in general. Here in North Carolina, we are seeing somewhat of a mixed response from our state and local governments. In general, the cities have been pretty good. They've been relatively quick to respond. Cities such as Charlotte, Greensboro, Durham, they've all been quick to respond with setting up rental assistance programs, providing eviction diversion assistance, food or transportation to COVID-19 testing locations. However, on the state side, on the state level, with both our executive and legislative branches, they have been somewhat of a source of frustration for advocates and for other housing-related stakeholders as well. The state has instituted some protections at the beginning of the pandemic in April. However, they have yet to put in place any kind of longer-term relief measures, particularly rental and mortgage assistance. Back in April, the North Carolina court system issued a directive postponing most legal proceedings, including evictions. That was a postponement that went until the end of June. And I call it a postponement. It's not a moratorium. The courts did allow evictions to continue to be filed. They just weren't scheduled for hearings, or other activities were not put forward to process those filings. That effort does seem to have been successful. It has helped keep thousands of people in their homes. Here in North Carolina, evictions in general during non-pandemic times are a big focal point amongst housing advocates. North Carolina is notoriously a state that has high eviction rates and low levels of tenant protections. So for us as housing advocates, it was good to see the courts step in with that relief measure at the start of the pandemic. Another move that has helped with maintaining some sense of housing stability for folks in North Carolina was an executive order issued by the governor at the end of March. That order prohibited utility companies from disconnecting services to customers because of non-payment. The moratorium also required that utility companies do provide a 6-month payment plan to customers. So for many folks who were struggling with their finances right now, not having to pay utilities was one factor that helped them to actually be able to make that rent or mortgage payment in full and on time. Unfortunately, both the utility shutoff moratorium and the eviction postponement have come to an end. Evictions started back up at the beginning of July, and utility disconnections just began again on July 30th. With the courts reopened and evictions back in play, the courts have surprisingly been proactive about enforcing the amount of protections that do exist for tenants here in North Carolina. When evictions began, the federal eviction moratorium was still in place. So one move that the courts made was to require landlords to also submit an affidavit along with their eviction filings to affirm that the subject property or tenant is not covered by the federal eviction moratorium. And then a couple weeks ago, when that federal moratorium officially ended, the Chief Justice who heads up the court system went ahead and extended the use of that affidavit and essentially reminded folks about the 30-day notice to vacate requirements. We just heard someone speak about that earlier. But language was added to the affidavit that's required to be submitted with eviction filings, also confirming that that 30 days requirement has been met. That wouldn't really apply until late August, but they've gone ahead and put that in place to remind folks about that. While this measure does put the onus on the landlord, to be honest about this, it does seem to be working to slow down the wave of evictions. The data does seem to suggest that the affidavit is holding off some amount of evictions. Some counties have seen their initial eviction numbers drop substantially when clerks started enforcing the use of the affidavit. In one county, for example, eviction filings were at 2,000 when evictions started. Then in a couple of days, they dropped down to under 500 because of this affidavit. With regards to the utility shutoff moratorium coming to an end, nothing so far has been done to extend that or offer additional relief on that front. So we've been advocating for the moratorium to be extended for residential customers, or at the very, very least for low-income residential customers. This is just very alarming for a couple of reasons. I think one, with a pandemic of a contagious virus, people should be able to have access to running water, the electricity or the gas to heat that water, just generally be able to, to cook and to have a habitable living space. One of the reasons that the governor allowed the utility shutoff moratorium to end is because numerous municipalities or municipality-owned utility companies started coming out warning that they would become insolvent or would need to go bankrupt if they were not able to begin disconnecting services and collecting back payments. So unfortunately, resources are scarce. The utility situation is pitting resources against each other. Renters and landlords need some measure of relief, and utility companies and local government do need to be able to continue to operate. So we've been advocating since the beginning of the pandemic for some statewide level of assistance to help people with rental, utility, and mortgage expenses. And right now, where we are, we see this being done in a couple of ways, and this is how we're focusing our state advocacy efforts. One, we have been calling on the state to use its portion of the CARES Act CDBG funds to provide rental and mortgage assistance. The governor here has hinted that this is a possibility. There are talks and work is being done to stand up some kind of rental assistance program using the CDBG funds. However, at this moment, it has not yet been implemented. We've been anxiously awaiting this rental program for at least 2 months now. And so that is definitely a source of frustration for us. Our officials are cautious about waiting to deploy CDBG because they have not seen the official Federal Register guidance and documents. And so that we have been trying to push them to go ahead and get the work done to go ahead and roll that out. Another effort that we have underway right now, we were able to get a bill introduced into our state's legislature to direct $200 million of North Carolina's coronavirus relief funds towards rental, utility, and mortgage assistance. That would be $140 million for renters and utility payments and $60 million for mortgage assistance. And unfortunately, that has been moving more slowly than we would definitely like to see. Some of our legislators are waiting to see if that money can be used to backfill budget holes due to decreased revenue. Another competing interest for those coronavirus relief funds are the utility companies. Here in North Carolina, there are over 1 million residential utility accounts that are delinquent. So there has been some talk of the need to put the coronavirus money that the state has left to put that towards utility companies and municipalities. So right now, our legislature is out on break until early September. We are continuing our push for more resources for the deployment of the resources that do exist. From our point of view, this has just gone on too long. Some estimates put the amount of money needed to cover those renters who are at risk at about 400 million just alone in the state of North Carolina. So we know that more resources are definitely needed from the state and from the federal level to get people the help that they desperately need right now. So those are the main things we're focused on in North Carolina. These calls are a great resource for us working at the state and local policy levels. And so thank you again to the NLIHC for having us on. And thank you again for all the great work that you guys do.
Thank you so much, Pam. Really appreciate that overview of what's going on in North Carolina. There was a question here, and I think it might be helpful for others. If you have time to respond, just please provide a little bit additional context to the affidavit requirement and about the turnoff of utility problems and solutions. And if you know, you don't have time to do it right here, maybe direct people to where they could learn more about particularly the affidavit. That would be really helpful. Thank you so much for that update. Okay, I'm going to see if George Hinton is with us from Social Development Commission of Wisconsin, is the CEO there. George, are you with us?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can. Thank you.
Oh, I'm so excited. First of all, how you doing? My name is George Hinton. I am very happy to be here. Thank you to the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I am CEO of Community Relations Social Development Commission. We're a community action agency, one of 1,000 in the nation. And so I'm here to just report off on some of the things that's going on in Milwaukee County, but specifically Milwaukee, where we see the greatest impact of the COVID virus and COVID-19, and also where we're seeing a whole lot of eviction activity. Milwaukee renters, like we always say, quality, affordable, and energy efficient homes are critical base need for people who live in poverty, and the impact that it may create on other parts of their lives. We in Milwaukee, in June, we had an increase of 26% evictions than we had the year ago in June, and that continued through July. The problems aren't going away. The Milwaukee, Waukesha, and West Dallas metropolitan area has its highest unemployment rate of 10%. And I would argue in Milwaukee it's probably a lot higher than that because we talk about the county. And then in communities, brown communities, we will see an even higher level of unemployment and its impact. In Milwaukee, of course, just like many other urban areas, we find ourselves with, while we're doing more testing, we continue to see more people who are affected by positive COVID-19 tests. In fact, we're at this point around 200 cases, averaging around 200 cases per day. We've also had a pretty significant, but not as high as other cities, death in our county at 456, and we represent the highest numbers in the state, being that we're the largest metropolitan area in the state of Wisconsin. I mention these so we can understand how badly people need meaningful long-term assistance. I want to just talk about a couple stories before I go into some other issues. We had this guy named Nick. He was about to start a new job when the virus shut down his opportunity. Nick was a single father with 2 daughters, filed for unemployment benefits and kept applying for jobs. He gave his landlord several $100s, all the money he had, and he couldn't pay the full amount for his home. This wasn't even in Milwaukee, but in Bayview, one of our townships. Nick was 3 months behind his rent when he applied for one of our rent assistance programs, which SDC has one from the state. There was another one through Community Advocates, which is from the county. And he was able to get his 3 months of assistance at the full $3,000 amount that we are able to give out for individuals who are in that process. We were able to work with the landlord to make sure he wasn't evicted. He says that it saved him. It was so big. When the landlord told me I got it, I stood up out of my chair. I literally jumped up around my living room. Those couple of months of rent being unpaid was, and the money that he received was literally saving the lives of his girls and himself. So that's just one story. And then we have another story about Deetra, a 44-year-old working in a local casino. 24 hours before she cleared her 90-day probation, she was furloughed. 3 months later, she was told it was a permanent furlough. We helped her also get some money for her eviction for her rent. And she, just before she was going to go into eviction. But unfortunately, we still haven't found, and she still hasn't found a job. So we have a rental assistance program, which we call RAP. In June, we saw the moratorium on rent discontinue in Milwaukee and across our state. And so far, we've been able to pay out about $1.1 million. We've been able to help about 530 households. We still have 30,000 people on our list. So even with the rate in which we're giving out money, we know that we won't be able to help more than half of the people that's on that list. But we're going to continue to advocate for more money from anywhere we can, especially from our local and state governments. But we are asking that there continue to be advocacy for federal funding, because we continue to have businesses closing, people losing jobs. We're going to be challenged when children go back to school and parents have to decide, can they work or make sure their children are doing their work at home. And then we're going to see a little of this continue for several months. SDC, which is a community action agency, is engaged in trying to provide as much support as we can to those individuals who are experiencing COVID related rent issues. But in Milwaukee, we were already having a lot of issues around rent and evictions because of the poverty situation in Milwaukee, especially the city of Milwaukee, in some respects in the state, as we bring in some of our rural counties. We continue to look at, we have programs out there like our outreach program, which we've sent out dozens of counselors and case managers to help identify the issues that individuals are going through, and then trying to help them find the resources in our community. And then what we do is we then refer them back to programs like the ones we have at SDC, which could be is something like our mental health programs, our career enhancement programs, our programs around housing, employment. We pretty much have a wraparound process at SDC. So we fully engaged that process into this crisis situation. But I do want to reiterate that while we have money from the COVID-related funding that came from the federal government, either through the state, county, or city, we continue to see that that's not enough. We believe we're going to have other, not only people who haven't been served yet, but people who will go back into a crisis stage when that money has exhausted itself and their landlords are back at a situation where they need to, or feel a need to take action against renters. So that's what I have to report on around Milwaukee County. You know, Milwaukee was going to be a national convention area. We were really looking forward to some of the economic impact that might have meant to the city. But because of the virus, that has been scaled down significantly. So we are going to continue to have some of the issues that we have, and we're going to advocate for, and I will definitely be working with you to advocate for additional funding to relieve some of the impact that this has had on our citizens and the children and our families. So thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, George. And thank you so much for the way you tied all that together at the end, where clearly, you know, state and local resources will not be nearly enough to address the you know, rental situation that's occurring in Wisconsin and and throughout the country. And we just absolutely have to have a robust federal response. So thank you so much for that update from Wisconsin. Okay, we're going to turn it now to our last field update, and Dan O'Meara, who is with Legal Aid Society of Hawaii. Dan, you have our last 5 minutes.
Great. Very much appreciative of you including us here in Hawaii on your meeting, and very much appreciate the patience and stamina for everybody who is hanging out here to the end to hear about us. I just wanted to give you some perspective on what's going on in Hawaii. So first, I just want to let you know that we have about 1.4 million people as our population. So the states above us and below us are West Virginia, Idaho, New Hampshire, and Maine. They're the ones closest to us in population. So, you know, our economy is very tourist driven and hospitality industry, and we have about 10 million tourists a year, which is over 30,000 per day. And right now, instead of 30,000 a day, we're measuring it in terms of 500 to 900 per day. So our unemployment rate is over 13%, it's close to 14%. Our housing is expensive. An average house here is over $700,000 for a typical house. So for perspective on our evictions, the state has about 2,500 evictions per year, which has been pretty consistent over the last 10 years with a little blip up in the foreclosure crisis. And right now we have a statewide eviction moratorium for non-payment of rent until August 31st. So we don't have to face the bubble at least until next month unless it's extended again. So we have a backlog statewide of about 1,000 to 1,200 evictions due after the moratorium, and we'll just have to see what increases above that. We don't really have a good feel. We've heard from 20 to 40% seem to be indications on other parts of the country, but you know, obviously we don't have as big a population or big a court system. Our usual default rates on evictions is about 50%. In our eviction cases, about 75% of landlords are represented by attorneys, and typically 3 to 4% of tenants are represented by attorneys. So it's a lot of disparity there. But we are working with the judiciary, and they're working with us and other landlord-tenant advocacy groups to prepare for the bubble when it bursts. The typical time in which it takes for a eviction once it's served is about 5 to 7 days, but they're looking at maybe extending that to be 30 days before they have people come to court, with the notion that there would be mediation before they go to court. So that's one of the things the judiciary is looking at here, to sort of be ready for what happens when it comes. Now, Hawaii has one of the highest per capita homeless rates in the country, which is due in part to the lack of our housing supply and the high cost of the homes here. In the last week, our COVID numbers have reached the highest since March, or no, since forever. So our highest numbers have been in the last week. They're, in absolute terms, they're not nearly as high as other states, but they're, for our purposes, they're high, and our state is basically shut down to travelers. They have to quarantine for 14 days if they come into the state. With our CARES money, right now, between the counties and the state, they're earmarking about $75 million plus for rental assistance, and they're just now getting the systems up in place, which are a little cumbersome so far to get the rental assistance. And then the last bit of information I want to pass on is our Public Housing Authority just last week passed a rule that tenants who receive 2 social distancing violations can now be evicted, which is a concern for us because of the potential disproportionate impact on our Micronesian and Pacific Islander populations. They are represented significantly in the public housing arena, and culturally they live in very large households. So we're going to kind of monitor and see where that's just meant as a wake-up call to the public housing tenants, or where they intend to enforce it or not. And other than that, I have nothing else to add, but appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. Dan, I really appreciate it. Unbelievable, the statistics you were sharing, 30,000 per day prior to this pandemic, down to 500 and 900 visitors per day. Unbelievable, the economic impact that must be having in your state. Thank you so much for that update. So I'm going to wrap it up with just a couple of comments. I just want to encourage everyone to join any of our working groups. In addition to these weekly calls, we have working groups, a legislative working group on COVID-19 on Tuesdays at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, a Working with FEMA working group call every other Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. The next one's tomorrow, August 11th. State and local implementation working group calls on Wednesdays at 3 p.m. And then we have a call for renters and resident leaders called Tenant Talk Live every other Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And the next one will be next Monday, August 17th. So please join us for those. You can find those by going onto our website, going to the COVID-19 section of our website, and you'll see a section there related to, join our working group calls. Then the last thing to say is, please keep up the advocacy. Do everything you can to reach out to your members of Congress, to engage the media. Really, the time is now. We've got to get this passed. So thank you all for joining us on today's call, and we hope to have you join us for next Monday's call. Let's get this thing passed in the meantime. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.